recording.
Yes, excellent. I brought some guests as well.
Hello.
Hey.
Hi, Gary.
Yeah, hey, for a bit I thought I was just going to be talking to a bunch of empty chairs.
No, that's Les Mis. That's the song on Les Mis, right?
Okay, you're up and running. You're streaming. You're
Very
live.
good. Where should I sit? In this chair?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, wherever you want, but
Where should I sit?
Wherever Riker sits on the bridge, you know.
Oh yeah, he usually sits.
You can be my number one.
To the left of the.
That's and I can say, make it so.
Make it
so that's the layout that's streaming to the web.
Okay. So I am looking there.
But I'm going to have it on here so you can see him.
Yep, sure. So I can look over here to see Gary, and then forward is
When you're talking to the you
Yep.
talk to the camera, you know, and then your camera
Yeah.
is right there.
Okay. Should we? Do you have microphones or?
I'm just miking you on this. Can
Yep.
you hear? Can you hear Anthony? Okay.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Anthony, from here, Anthony sounds weak.
Okay.
Yeah, he's going to sound weak, but can you hear him well enough?
I'll try to talk loud.
Would it make more sense for him and I to switch because he had a softer voice? Switch.
Or I guess it's-
Not really, because you're not facing the mic, so it works out. Just be sure to enunciate for his
Okay.
sake, you know, or project for his sake.
Yeah, I'll try to project using my theater voice.
That's right.
All right.
Very good.
Yeah.
Have fun.
Okay.
Thanks. I talked to Corey. He said he would show up.
Okay.
Or he tried to.
Sure. So it sounds like we're live then?
What time is it? Oh, it's 1 o'clock.
Yep. I think Hawk has gone ahead and started us.
Yeah,
So
left us to our own
let me
devices.
just pull up. I just want to make sure I pull up Letters of Tolkien. I've loaned out I misplaced my physical copy, so I have my backup digital copy.
Yeah.
But at least I know it's legal, Gary, right? After suggesting you get a physical copy, I thought, boy, I need to not be a hypocrite. I need to have my own physical copy, so I ordered one right away.
Hello, welcome.
Doesn't Hawk have his
Yeah,
own?
you shamed me into it.
I did. Well, now I shamed myself.
Hello, welcome.
Well, I wonder what Tolkien would think about copyright. You know, he was not an anarchist, but he was for government light, right? And I wonder, but
Yeah.
at the same time, as an author, no doubt he would have supported some rights for authors
Yeah.
to get their due. I don't know. I mean, he had that whole thing in America with the Ace paperbacks, right?
Oh yeah, he went after them.
He wouldn't- yeah.
I think, you know, from reading his letters, to certain people, I think he would be very jealous of, you know, somebody stealing his work.
Yeah, IP, intellectual property, right? Yeah, yeah, for sure. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and, unless that was maybe, do you think, well, we'll see. There's people who will be coming in, so you might hear the doorbell, those of you who have joined us online, or see this later on.
Oh, have we started recording?
I believe he has.
Okay.
You want to check?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm assuming that he would have left it recording.
Okay, it's recording.
Yeah, very good.
Okay, and streaming.
Yep. But now there's an empty couch, an empty chair.
Oh, I'll sit there. Don't worry.
Good. You
Is
don't
it the same couch?
Yeah, Anthony's actually an automaton. He's not really here.
I'm a ghost.
That's right.
From where I'm sitting, he's sitting on both sides of the couch.
Oh yes, that's true. No fair. You outnumbered me.
Yes.
Anthony.
That's
No,
my.
actually, one of those is the bibliophile, Anthony, and the other one is the grammar critic, who will be roundly correcting me for every mispronunciation.
Every grammatical error, every mispronunciation.
That's right. Yes, it's the good cop and bad cop. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the Ea Tolkien Society. It's a Smial of the, and there's another pronunciation thing we had to work out. I always for years thought it was a Smial.
Yeah, me too.
but it apparently is a Smial, which just means a small gathering or settlement of the Tolkien Society, which is based in the United Kingdom. and so as an official Smial, we love to pass on, or carry on with the mission and tradition, which is to make the works of j.r.r. Tolkien more accessible, to be able to talk about them, share ideas, and then seeing just different ways in which that also will be maybe influencing culture, pop culture now. And also today we are going to be looking at specifically kind of the late antiquity period of time in which we are looking specifically at how Tolkien was influenced by ancient texts. We looked last month at the way in which Christian, Hebrew, thinking of some of the Hebrew and Greek Old and New Testament influenced Tolkien as a writer, but also looking at some of the Greek mythology. We did not get a chance to talk about Egyptian. I noticed that was on here in the Epic of Gilgamesh, so we never maybe tied into that as much.
Yeah, well, those are sort of later editions.
Later editions, so maybe those are ones we can come back to at some point. But and then today we'll be planning to talk about some of the writers from the Roman Empire, and also Augustine of Hippo, the Christian writer and early church father. These are different influences we'll be looking at, and then I suggest next month is when we tackle the early Middle Ages with so much, because that's going to include the Beowulf, the Eddas, the Volsunga saga, the Mabinogion, the Kalevala.
Yeah.
I mean, we're really taking a nice big bite of juicy myth and story and narrative, all these things that really were Tolkien's bread and butter. So that's kind of what I think next month will be perfect for, and maybe even we can talk a little bit about how we're going to do that, so we can really prepare, because we're all duffers here, but we can just maybe do a little bit more prep for that, and maybe each of us would be willing to take one of those and speak to, okay, well, how was Tolkien influenced by Beowulf? And maybe one of us could take that, and someone could take the Eddas, one of us could take the Kalevala, the Mabinogion, etc. So that's just a thought for you to think about, for you, Gary, and for you, Anthony.
And we have Chris Cooperstein also.
And Chris Cooperstein's there as well. Chris, welcome, Chris. And so, that's something we can get to after we conclude kind of our late antiquity period. But let me go ahead and get started with the notes.
Brian, before you do,
Yes.
the feed from you guys kind of got really funky.
Does that mean the video?
No, I've got myself and Chris here, large, and then I've got your arm and
Oh, I see.
the couch and myself and Chris in a smaller format. And I'm just wondering, it's kind of distracting.
So it's a Jitsi setting for
Yeah.
Which is it, like a gallery? Are we on gallery maybe right now, kind of?
Yeah, let me see.
Yeah, kind of
And probably in the settings down below, we might be able to. How is that? That's whoever's speaking currently. Does that work?
Is it changed?
No,
Try-
I'm just seeing your elbow.
Okay. Oh, I'm fixing the computer here right now, or trying to. Hawk said the setup's kind of weird right now.
What if you, Gary, if you muted yourself for a moment? I'm curious whether it would show us. At least I know in Zoom that's how.
No, I don't think it would show us.
It doesn't show it even if he's muted.
No.
Because. Okay, let me.
If Gary uses the setting toggle tile view,
Okay.
He will change the
Okay.
view into where we're all at the side, and
Okay.
the main
Put it back the way it was then.
picture is.
Yes. So Gary, on your side, try to see if you can change the view. On the bottom of your screen, there should be like 4 little panes, like 4 little squares, I think.
Okay, yeah, I see it, just a second. Yeah, that's better.
Okay, can you?
Still the kind of a gallery thing.
Okay, so you're not seeing me super well. Would it help if I moved over to?
Well, no, I mean, I see you perfectly now. You can sit in that comfortable chair.
Okay.
I see, I think it's Anthony back in you,
Oh yeah, I'm fixing the computer. I'll move back to my chair. But how does that work for you?
Chris, can you see us fine? Are you able to see us okay?
I'm plenty fine as it
Okay.
is,
All right.
except for screaming children in the background.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, I can't do anything about that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and ask if anybody would like to read the notes from last month. If not, I can, but I'm always happy to share that. Does anybody volunteer?
I
I
can.
was not here, I was in cardiac rehab.
Oh dear, I'm sorry to hear that.
Hello, welcome.
Well, I missed lunch with Chris, so he came through here.
Well, that's no excuse.
He would just let me out.
Yeah, just joking. Okay,
Hello, welcome.
so I'm gonna.
Oh, that's gonna be
I
annoying.
think there's a way to turn that off.
Hello,
Let
welcome.
me see if I can do that since Hawk's down below.
Yeah. We
Hello,
can
welcome.
turn that on after the meeting. I think we got it. Okay, cool. Oh no! I spoke too soon.
Hello, welcome. Hello, welcome. Hello, Hello, welcome.
Yeah, I hope Hawk doesn't get mad. Oh dear.
I have no idea what I'm doing.
Yeah. Oh man.
All right,
Hope
I'm gonna
Hawk
leave it
doesn't-
as it is.
Let's see.
All right. All right, let's try to salvage this. Let's try to salvage this meeting here. Many apologies to the interruptions. Okay, we're going to start over, and Anthony is going to read the notes from December 17th. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. And if you need me to speak up, just let me know. Otherwise, here are the notes from our last meeting with the Ea Tolkien Society, December 17th, 2022, a Saturday. We had in attendance Brian, Hawk, myself, and then we had Chris and Sarah online. First order of business was that Brian read the notes from the previous meeting. Then we got into a new discussion on books that j.r.r. Tolkien books that have been published lately. One is the Fall of Numenor book, edited by Brian Sibley, which basically combines all of Tolkien's writings concerning Numenor and the Second Age into one volume. We also mentioned the recent publication of the new illustrated edition of the Silmarillion, illustrated by none other than the professor himself. And then I mentioned an article from thewondering.net about the Welsh Opera House performing an adaptation of the Silmarillion in operatic form called Tales of the Silmarillion. And then Chris Cooperstein got into some articles from Entertainment Weekly and Deadline about, let's see, the first one was something about Hobbiton and Airbnb. I forget what that was about. And then article from Deadline announcing season 2 directors for The Rings of Power, the new TV show. And then Hawk gave a shout out to the volunteer and artist Natalia in New Zealand, who I think is affiliated with RPG Research.
That's right.
And also he mentioned that RPG Research is mentioned in a book called Welcome to Dragon Talk, which is, I believe, a podcast on RPGs.
That's right. Yeah, it was when they were featured once
Yeah.
on there. So
Yeah, I think I've seen part of it.
really neat.
Yeah. Okay, then we delved into some of the classical sources that influenced Tolkien, particularly the Judeo-Christian and ancient Greek sources.
Mm-hmm.
For starters, we talked about how the Tolkien's inspiration for the dwarves kind of came from just the Jews, and the language of Khosdul sort of had took some inspiration from ancient Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe Brian mentioned how in the second book of Samuel, there's a mention of the sound of trees marching,
Mm-hmm.
which of course
Or a
mimic.
reference to the ants, maybe an inspiration for the
Yeah.
ants. Yeah.
And that there's a sort of a deeper influence from the Hebrew Bible and on the Christian and the New Testament as well. I think on the Christian view of of creation.
I think it was that idea that there's nothing that is initially evil, right?
Yeah.
It begins good, even Morgoth.
Yeah.
And he was. Did he contribute? Is that what the next point there? Was that what that was
Yeah, I
about?
think we. Next point is I think Tolkien contributed to translations of the Jerusalem Bible. I forget when that was published, but I think I used that also for college.
I'll look that up.
Anyways, then we talked about how in a letter to Robert Murray, S.J., a good Jesuit, Tolkien wrote that The Lord of the Rings is, of course, fundamentally a religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously so in the revision. That is why I have not put in or have cut out practically all references to anything like religion, to cults or practices in the imaginary world, for the religious element is absorbed into the story and the sibyllum. So kind of a more nuanced kind of absorption of religion into his work, not necessarily explicit, but sort of implicit
That's right.
in its theme. Let's see, and then this tapestry is his own. I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah, I can't remember. Chris, do you remember? Can you hear Anthony okay?
No, I don't remember.
Okay.
The tapestry, I think that might be from just a reference to the idea that it was, and I can't remember who the quotation was from,
Yeah.
but that he had created his own unique
Yeah.
story out of these threads.
And we mentioned how Tolkien's lasting influence was based on a mix of Christian and classical influences, and that voluntary sacrifice is a key theme in his work, especially with Frodo voluntarily choosing to bear the ring to Mordor.
Mm-hmm.
Then we kind of delved into some Greek sources. I kind of talked about how we mentioned, I think, first the Ainulindale, the creation of Ea in the world, and the music of the Ainur, and how it was the creation of the universe in Tolkien's work was through music.
That was really interesting about the Greeks. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I mentioned how that the original epic poems by like Homer and Hesiod would have been actually probably sung by these wandering rhapsodes in Greece called aoidoi, singular aoidas. They would have probably, told or sang these stories orally.
Would they be like a minstrel or more like a skald? I mean,
Probably more like a skald, yeah.
Okay.
But skalds, I think, were members of, or they were employed in, like
by court.
Yeah, by a court. Whereas
Yeah.
these were probably could have been sung out in the
Wandering.
street. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Maybe a troubadour almost.
Yeah. Then I mentioned how I'd recently read Hesiod, who is a Greek epic poet alongside Homer in stature, and how his Theogony, which details the creation of the world according to Greek myth, is kind of parallels the Valaquenta, and that there are some parallels between the Greek gods and the Tolkien's gods, although the Greek gods are a little bit more, shall we say, human-like than I think Tolkien's, than the
Compared to
Tolkien's
the Valar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They have more human foibles and flaws. I think Sarah mentioned something about how Turin's journey to Dor-lómin is like Odysseus's return to visit his wife, see his wife Penelope. I forget Turin's story, but of course Odysseus finally makes it home to see his wife Penelope, but she has all these suitors who are trying to compete for her attention, and he ends up, of course, doing battle with them. Then we read and discussed Tolkien's letter 211. And then...
I wasn't sure about that because I had to leave early.
Okay.
So I was just wondering if you can speak to that. Did you guys end up reading?
I think so, yes. I forget the exact contents of the letter, but I
Right.
can...
This is the one to Rona Beer.
Run a bear, yeah.
Rona Beer about Ea Rendel, the Aya Erendil Elenian Ankalima.
Yeah.
So is that something you guys had talked about?
Yes. I think. Okay. Yeah.
Which is fine. I just was curious whether
Yeah,
or not
yeah.
that's something that you,
Yeah.
if you had read that or not.
Yeah, let me see. Oh yeah, this was quite a long letter. He addressed a number of different questions about one of which was what the Numenorians would have looked like. I think there was he sort of yes, here we go. The Numenorians of Gondor. He said that they were best pictured in Egyptian terms, which I kind of found fascinating because I love ancient Egypt, and especially with regards to the kind of helmet, the helmet worn by the pharaohs would have closely resembled what Tolkien envisioned for the Numenorian kings and queens.
That is fascinating.
Yeah. And
The
which
upper
is,
and lower Nile,
yeah.
the two crowns kind of combined together.
Because Egypt was originally two separate kingdoms, but they
That's
were
right.
united in like 3000 BC by
Mhm.
Narmer.
Hmm.
So that was one of the questions. And then I think he went into some details on etymologies of the word of Elros and Elrond, the L, especially the L prefix in names like Elrond, Elros, Eladan, Elrohir.
It is Elros then, isn't it? Is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
the twin brother of Elrond.
Yeah, because for years I would say Elros, but I think
Could be either. I'm not quite
could
sure.
be either. Yeah.
But Rondo was a primitive Elvish word for cavern. We see this in like Nargothrond,
Hmm.
Aglarond, stuff like that. And do you want to talk about anything else, or?
No, I think that's great.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Thanks for the recap.
You're welcome.
And I got something to add. I wasn't here.
Yeah, go ahead.
And one of the things I found very interesting is when I became a member, I started getting these things called Amen, whatever.
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
on head,
So
yeah.
I was thinking about when you mentioned the ancient sources behind Tolkien's work, Plato with the Greeks
Yeah,
and the destruction of Atlantis.
yeah.
And how it mirrored the destruction of Numenor. But I'm also, and this is just my thoughts, that somehow there might have been a pillar of truth in Plato, even though he put it about 10,000 years before his time, about the destruction of the kingdom, of the island kingdom.
Atlantis.
And yeah, Atlantis. And then I picked up this book years ago by Charles Palomino. And it's quite interesting because it's about the Minoan kingdom, quite advanced for its age, I think 1600 BC.
Yeah.
And anyway, it had a huge, it collapsed, the whole island collapsed except for the outer ring of it, which I think now called Centauri. Centauri, and it was called Thera at the time, but I wondered if that had any bearing on his, referring back to Amen now, in the June vision, on his nightmare about being overtaken by a huge flood that he had both as a child and also as an adult.
Huh.
Yeah.
Because the parallel is the sinking moon.
Interesting.
And I mean, apparently you could get rid of that nightmare.
Yeah, that's true. The wave dream or nightmare. Yeah, that is very fascinating. I do think that's quite interesting, just how an author's life ends up kind of showing up in his fiction, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
One connection I would also like to make to letter, since just in review of the notes, 211 is it is a long letter,
Yeah.
but towards the end, he says two things that are really, I think, important. And I think of these because I often listen to the podcast, the Prancing Pony podcast, and one of the things that they refer to that's in this letter is at the very end he refers to serial longevity. So the elves are not immortal per se. They are. He distinguishes between something which I'm trying to remember how it's like they are confined in a sense to Arda.
Yeah.
Middle Earth is like their fate is tied to the land in a way that it is not for men, and so the elves are extremely long lived. They don't die of just natural causes or whatever, but they're not immortal in the sense of being incapable of dying.
Yeah.
They are just they have serial longevity. So I think it's really good to remember that with the elves. And then the other thing that I thought was just really neat is how at the end of the letter, and you probably talked about this already last time, but I wasn't there, so now I get to see my piece. But Medanyard, I can't even say it now. Medanyard. I think that's how you say it in Old English.
Oh yeah.
Medanyard is Middle Earth, and he talks about how it's not in a galaxy, long ago in a galaxy far, far away. It's long ago here. He locates Middle Earth here, not another planet, not even another universe or whatever, but very much tied to Earth. Not because he's like, oh yes, and Romania is Mordor or anything like that. It's more just about that sense of something that has passed away. We've lost the knowledge of where things were, but it's this idea that there is a connection. And I just love this quote where he says, "I could have fitted things in with greater verisimilitude if the story had not become too far developed before the question ever occurred to me." So I think Tolkien saw a lot of connections there. It's meant to be a European myth,
Yeah.
but it's not meant to be too closely resembling modern day.
Yeah.
So I just love that. It's pretty cool because when you ask people, I think most people would not realize when he's talking about Middle Earth, he's talking about
Really, our
this world, our world,
but it's set in sort of a legendary past.
in a legendary past.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Well said. Well said.
Thanks.
Okay, so I guess that was it for the notes. Any other comments before we move on to our new business? Not business, but new agenda. Is there anything that somebody wants to make sure that we talk about today? New things that you've seen in the news? Yeah.
Yeah. So
Oh,
there's
yes.
Oh yeah. Do you want to go first, Chris, or?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So there's yet another new Tolkien book coming out. It's actually a translation of the Old English poem "The Battle of Malden," which I think the Battle of Malden itself happened in the year 991 between the Northumbrians and some other Anglo-Saxon kingdom or tribe. Because back then, England was not, disparate kingdoms of Anglo-Saxons, and it's being published together in sort of a definitive book with the homecoming of Beornthald's son. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but and it'll be available. I can't remember when, but I'll find it somewhere here on the web. Here it is. It'll be published March 30th, 2023. So I think the homecoming. So yeah, the Battle of Malden is a poem about the battle itself. Well, it was between Vikings, I think, and
Yeah, because by 991, if that date is correct, all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had actually been joined into one kingdom.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Of England, because although not Alfred called himself King of the English, but it wasn't until his grandson Athelstan that they were all formed into one kingdom.
Oh, you sure know know a lot about it.
Sure.
Yeah.
So it was against Vikings, was it?
Yeah, so in 991 AD, Vikings attacked an Anglo-Saxon defense force led by their duke, Beorhtnoth, resulting in brutal fighting along the banks of the River Blackwater, near Malden and Essex. The attack is widely considered one of the defining conflicts of 10th century England, due to it being immortalized in the poem The Battle of Malden. Written shortly after the battle, the poem now survives only as a 325-line fragment, but its value to today is incalculable, not just as a heroic tale, but in vividly expressing the lost language of our ancestors and celebrating ideals of loyalty and friendship.
Okay, wonderful. Did you have any comments on that, Chris, or is it something else?
No, it's other things.
Okay. Before we get to that, then, did anybody want to comment on this new book? Is it entitled "The Battle of Malden"?
Yeah, j.r.r. Tolkien's The Battle of Malden, together with The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's great. And Chris Cooperstein, what did you have for us today?
Got a couple things. There is a rumor spreading that a particular creature is going to appear in season 2 of The Rings Tower.
Oh
And he seems to have been in the western forest. And he possesses enormous power.
Oh, I know who you're talking about. Tom Bombadil?
Yes.
Oh, Bombadil.
That is fantastic.
Eventually, Bombadil will make his face appear in season 2.
At long last.
I think we talked about this last meeting, yeah. This will probably make up for his absence in the Peter
Well, I
Jackson
should
films.
say so. I think he'll have to appear and say, "It's about time I got some screen."
Yeah. And speak in rhymes. And
There you go. There you go.
And then this piece of news is for Sarah. May she watch this at some point and find it out. There is a power metal group called Ruined Throne in Italy that has released a j.r.r. Tolkien inspired album called The Unconscious Mind of Arden. And I'm almost as much of a fan of metal in the right frame of mind as I am of opera. So
Wow.
Nice.
to bring a little balance to the opera thing, I think this was a pretty cool line, and that their music seems to be pretty well done and understood for as much as you can with rock metal groups. And then the third item was another article about the rings of power ignoring, at least in season 1, Galadriel's husband.
Celeborn?
Yes.
Okay. Were they...
And how editorially that was a good move for season 1. And there's a lot of things in the comments. This is an MSN article. There's a lot of things in the comments that seem to indicate, no, it's a bad editorial move, and they should have mentioned something.
So were Galadriel and Celeborn like together at that point, or were they, I don't know, dating in the Elvish equivalent?
Protracted engagement.
Yeah,
Right, something like that.
Because I think Tolkien wrote a whole thing called The History of Galadriel and Celeborn in Unfinished Tales. I forget where he kind of goes into detail the history of their relationship, and I can't remember exactly when they were married, married or.
Yeah, I don't think it ever really says.
I could look it up. But
Yeah.
And then there's a bit of a love story and spat between Galadriel and Celebrimbor as well. So
in the books or in the Rings of Power?
in the Rings of Power,
Okay.
potentially. To be determined. Season 2. So
Great.
it's also a rumor.
Yep. Rumors abound, but those are interesting. Gary, any comments on these 2 items in the news or something else?
I'm just curious, you said the year 991, that the English, as they were back then, took on the Vikings.
I think,
Yeah.
was that 991 you said?
Yes. 991 AD.
I'm just curious about, William Conqueror came over in 1066.
Yes.
And I thought he kind of changed his or his people, changed the complexion of England as far as who was there.
Yeah.
I can't remember if they were Angles or they were Saxon.
They were Normans.
Normans, okay.
So do you know kind of the background of the Normans?
They were in France.
Right. So Normandy. So that was actually referring to the Northmen, right? So these
Yeah.
were Vikings who had actually conquered part of France,
Yeah.
and their name then was used in the land that they had conquered. And Rollo, which I always joke when I'm teaching my 5th graders about this, I'm like, the chieftain of these Vikings who got this land as a concession from the King of France, he was called Rollo, but he was probably, not big and jolly like you think of Rollo.
Yeah.
Quite a name for a Viking, but so it's from him and his group of Vikings. I can't remember if these were Danish or Swedish or Norwegian Vikings, but they took over that area, and then they would go on raiding parties. But eventually they settled down and started speaking French and riding horses, which is kind of terrifying to think of Vikings riding horses. But of course they started to change because this is, oh my goodness, over a 200-year period, right? But they still were fairly bloodthirsty, even though they had embraced the kind of cultural chivalry of the horse, honor,
Yeah.
all that. Yeah, really interesting. So yeah, they did. I've been listening to a different podcast, which is very good, called the British History Podcast.
Oh, I think I've heard of that.
And he's in episode, I think, 403 right now, and he's only to just after the conquest,
Yeah, Battle Hastings.
the Battle of Hastings in 1066. So it's really a very granular, deep dive into all of it.
Nice.
But yeah, so good catch there, Gary. This is less than 100 years before a really big disruption in society in England. Although Vikings would have been a similar disruption, but they never completely were able to take over all of Britain.
Yeah.
But the Danelaw would have represented like essentially half of England that they did have quite a bit of legal and just political power over. And York was their, and basically their headquarters for a long time, their capital. And that's actually a Viking name, Jorvik. So that becomes Yorick, which becomes York. And then eventually the Anglo-Saxons take back control of all the land, Northumbria, as you mentioned. But there's a lot of Vikings or Danes who were born there, and they basically accept the English rule. So you've got mixed English and Danish ancestry there. And a lot of the town names that end in BY, Whitby, Sunderby, anything that ends in BY that's a Norse ending. So all those place names are from that. And you find them almost all in eastern England or northeastern England. So, but but this would be this battle would have been in, I would say, the flower or the golden age of the Anglo-Saxons. So it's no surprise to me that Tolkien would want to say, I want to go back to a time before the conquest,
Yeah.
you know, where you see what does it look like when you have a Anglo-Saxon culture that's influenced by Christianity, so it's not pagan like the Vikings,
Yeah.
but on the other hand still has this warrior like mentality and stories that they tell. Literacy was growing. As you probably know, Alfred the Great, you know, really emphasized learning English. He encouraged his thanes to learn English. So I'm sorry, I'm going down the rabbit hole on my favorite topics. So
Right.
anything else on that, Gary, you wanted to say about either the conquest?
I appreciate all the information. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
All I remember was 1066, the Battle of Hastings, and William the Conqueror.
I will say one more thing quickly, and that is that what we don't realize is, and this is not meant to sound cynical, right? So there's that quotation that history is written by the victors.
Yes.
Now I think that can be a little cynical in the way that that's said, but I think there's an element of truth to it. And one of the elements of that would be true is that typically when we look at a list of the kings of England, they almost always start with William the First.
Yeah.
Not so though, because that basically is saying, oh yes, well those people who came before weren't really kings. So it's actually the Norman. That is a leftover from the Normans trying to kind of sweep under the carpet and say, well, we're really the legitimate rulers.
England.
Yeah, and the same would be, you know, kind of downplaying English literature, downplaying English achievements. To be English was kind of considered second class,
Yeah.
which is why French was the language that was used if you wanted to get a good job.
Yeah.
And to this day, we still have in our language both forms for food. Boeuf is a French word. It is what happens when you take your cow, which is an Anglo-Saxon word, or kine. You kill the cow, but when you serve it for your Norman overlord, you bring it to him, it becomes boeuf, because this is the French, the Norman French word for it.
Yeah.
We have lamb, which becomes mouton, mutton. We have calf, which becomes veal, French word. We have, there's a whole bunch. Poultry is a French word
Oh yeah.
instead of chicken, which is an Anglo-Saxon word. So when it becomes food on your plate for the guy in the big house on the hill, it's a French word. And we still use it today.
Very good observation.
There we go.
Speaking of one who has a cow in the field right now, yes, it will be turning into beef here
Yeah.
in the not too distant future.
Oh yeah. I just ate a cow for lunch.
Yeah,
Beef.
that's right.
Cheese
And in German, it's still Kuh, right? So you can see the Saxon origin to that word. Anyway, I digress. Big
Yeah,
time.
that was good.
Well, great, guys. That was really helpful. I put down in our notes that we referred to the Battle of Malden book. Chris mentioned the rumors and about Tom Bombadil and other things going on. I put down this album, Unconscious Mind of Arda, and then I didn't quite get down what you said, the reference to Celeborn and Galadriel. Was it having to do with rumors of season 2?
Yes, rumors of season 2.
Yeah.
Okay,
yet
so
to come.
I'll put down Celeborn alongside Tom as possible, new faces, and then also Gary's comment on the Battle of Hastings. I really cannot overstate that the time period between the Battle of Malden and the Battle of Hastings is one of the most politically tumultuous times for Britain.
Yeah.
And the guy who was king that was killed at the Battle of Hastings, Harold Godwinson,
Yeah.
I always thought he was a hero. But when you read about him, a lot of what happened was actually that family's fault, the Godwinsons' fault.
Yeah, their manipulation of power.
Yes.
Especially of Edward the Confessor.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's not all black and white, unfortunately. So. Okay. I do want to mention that on I did check the Facebook feed for our group, which is not very active, but there is Thomas Morwinski did share a link to our group, and it was for Other Minds magazine. And here is the announcement. It says this is as of December 21, which was after our last meeting. Dear all, the long wait is over, and issue number 26, 77 pages of our magazine has been published. Beside the usual sections, this issue brings you the following contributions. So here's what you can look in if you go onto Facebook, and you can find it in, and it's also a, I'll try to put a link in the notes for you all, if you want to look at there. But the Facebook group Other Minds Magazine, you can also find it there. Here are some of the articles in this magazine. Learning Spells and Role-Playing Games Set in Middle-earth.
Ooh, nice.
By Thomas Morwinski. Discussion about the existence and possible use of learnable magic spells in Middle-earth. The Rangers of the North by Gabrielle Quaglia. A description of the history and organization of this famous Dunedain group. Review, Ruins of the Lost Realm by Thomas Morwinski. Review of Tor's second edition, first source book, which we've been using actually, just in our last session. A New Stronghold by Andreas Erdmann. The third installment of Andreas' Ravens in the North campaign. These are obviously Middle-earth based role-playing. Wild Men of the South by Adam Brown. Tor's second adventure in Eriador and beyond. Where in Breeland is Combe Valley by Chris Goldsmith. Discussion of the finer details of Breeland's geography with a focus on Combe, the village near Bree. Have fun with reading this issue, and please give us feedback, especially typos or other issues you spot. Speaking from experience, I'm pretty sure we will need at least one update to read them all out. And please share this announcement freely to all those interested, as well as the Other Minds Facebook group. We welcome everyone. The bigger our community, the better. And you can download the issue directly under this link for the OM team, Thomas. So again, thank you, Thomas Morwinski, for working hard on that, and for all the contributors to Other Minds Magazine, for those who enjoy both Tolkien's world and the stories of it, as well as role-playing in it. They might find that interesting. So I just want to make a shout out to that. Otherwise, we can start as soon as you want on talking about the next period of time. Any comments on Other Minds Magazine before we move on? Okay. I haven't seen any comments on YouTube. I'm not as good as Hawk is at checking all the places where people might be commenting, but I haven't seen anything from Sarah. There is one person, two people now watching, so we're glad that you're following along. And so if you put comments in the YouTube feed, we're live streaming on there at Tolkien Scholars, which is our YouTube channel, and I will try to watch for that. Otherwise, let's go ahead, Anthony, and move on to Tolkien's literary influences. And just a reminder to everyone, we kind of have been working backwards in time, and then now we're working forwards in time.
Yeah.
So we started with Tolkien and said, what were the recent fantasy authors, right, that he had an influence on? What would be an example or two of some of those authors that you can recall?
George.R.R. Martin.
George.R.R. Martin. Stephen Lawhead. Talked about several other fantasy authors. Really, kind of a huge shadow on fantasy nowadays, right?
Yeah, Michael Moorcock. I mean, he's even though he's a critic of Tolkien, he still acknowledges the influence. So
on that spectrum.
Same with Martin too. I think Brandon Sanderson, Robert Jordan.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even though they've kind of wanted to move away from Tolkien,
sure. But Sanderson said in his essay, I'm inspired by Tolkien to do my own thing.
Of course, yeah.
Rather than trying to copy him. So
that was a great manifesto on fantasy fiction today.
Really was.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that.
Where it should head.
And then we worked backwards to his contemporary, his peers, writers in his time. We looked at the Inklings, specifically C.S. Lewis, Charles Williams, and others. And of course, it's only recently in the last couple of years that we've lost, Christopher Tolkien, j.r.r. Tolkien's son, who was a member of the Inklings as well. And so, kind of some of the last connections to
And also Priscilla Tolkien. The last of the Numenorians. As
Yes,
Sarah,
indeed.
I think, called him.
The last of his 4 children, I think, passed away.
I
wasn't
think
it?
so, yeah.
Yeah. So really an end of an era. And then we kind of then said, okay, let's look at past influences on Tolkien.
Right.
Not just his peers and who he influenced or who influenced him, but looking backwards. So we decided it made more sense to start kind of at the far end in ancient history and ancient authors. And so we did that last time, didn't we?
Yes.
And as you already had mentioned in the notes, covered the Greek writers and also looking at Hebrew and Christian influences, or at least looking at the Bible. But now we have Livy ab urbe condita, Virgil, the Aeneid, thank you for helping me there.
Yeah.
Ovid, the Metamorphoses, and Augustine of Hippo, the City of God and Confessions. So that's what we're covering today. So Anthony, I'm going to kind of ask, where would you like to start here?
I first want to mention that I put Livy in there. I think that was the first author you mentioned.
Yes.
He wrote his monumental Ob Urbe Condita, which means from the founding of the city. Which,
Okay, Urbe, city, yeah.
Yeah. From that, urbs meaning city.
Right?
And that was like a monumental history of Rome in 142 books.
Oh, that's right. He's the historian, isn't
Yes,
he?
he's the historian. And I kind of put him in there because even if Tolkien didn't explicitly acknowledge him as an influence,
Right.
Livy goes into detail about the founding of really just the founding of Roman civilization, and makes some reference to mythology, but it's mostly it's told from a little bit more of a factual basis rather than, because Livy had access to some sources about the dates of which consuls ruled in the Roman Republic, and
Right.
Before that there were the 7 kings of Rome, and some of those stories I think of Rome's founding and early history I think played an influence on Tolkien and his creation of Middle Earth, because Tolkien embedded within his work a sense of history.
That's one of the things that I think attracts a lot of us to Tolkien, is that
Yeah.
sense of history within his work.
Yeah, as you as a history teacher and me as a history buff, we can both appreciate this, and hopefully our audience will too. The verisimilitude of Tolkien's work is what attracts, the sense of realness, grounding in reality.
Because he read so much history, he was able to create a historical sounding narrative.
Yeah, and I think also Tolkien as an undergraduate specialized in the classics, Greek and Roman classics, before switching to
I did
his
not know
study
that.
of Anglo-Saxon and Norse literature.
Wow.
I believe so. Might have been after his freshman year, or the English equivalent.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Gary or Chris, any comments on Livy's history of Rome, or just the Roman time period, or Tolkien as a historian or as a student of history?
Well, I wonder. So, Oxford, Cambridge, and other universities around the UK at the time when Tolkien was a professor
Yeah.
had access to, I'm going to say, a near unlimited or the best sources of Western civilization historical documents to draw on.
Oh man.
And, they had the ability to draw from all these sources.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like having Google today. But I think he, as a professor, had some access that maybe a fantasy or fiction writer today may not exactly have access to the original sources in the way that a professor at a prestigious college would have.
Yeah, just
And
like
that certainly influenced his writing.
Yeah, like the Bodleian Library in Oxford. I mean, itself contains a huge number of manuscripts of literature and other types of genres.
It's a beautiful place.
Have you been there?
I have not been into the Bodleian, but well, yes, I have actually. There was an exhibit I once saw when we were there and I'm trying to remember if it was in the Bodleian Library, if it was in the Radcliffe Camera, which is basically a round building.
Yeah, I know what you're talking
And
about.
I can't remember where it was, but it was. They had an exhibit of some of Tolkien's illustrations that they had in their archives, but they belonged to the Bodleian Library.
Wow.
So yeah, it was really neat.
Oh my gosh, I'm jealous.
Yeah. I'm just looking this up. This is really fascinating because I don't really know much about this time period. Livy apparently lived from 59 BC to AD 17.
Yeah.
So he really could. He had access to sources that could write about the early history. Because when I think Roman history, right, I'm thinking about history of the Roman Empire from Julius Caesar forward.
Oh no, this goes way back.
But this guy was a contemporary of Julius Caesar.
Yeah, and also of Augustus, the first.
Exactly.
emperor.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
For sure.
Caesar.
So
Caesar Augustus, right?
yeah, so he predates and kind of butts up against Rome in some ways.
Right.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting too that apparently, from what I can tell here, there was I was wondering what kind of library was there, and the Ulpian or the Bibliotheca Ulpia was a Roman library founded by Emperor Trajan, but that wasn't until AD 114.
Yeah.
And that was considered one of the most prominent and famous libraries of antiquity and became the major library in the Western world upon the destruction of the Library of Alexandria in the 3rd century. But I wonder what did Livy have access to?
Well, even in Livy's own time, a lot of knowledge about the early history of Rome, going back to its founding in 753 BC, would have been kind of lost to time. And also, back then, the genre of writing history would have been kind of different from... The conception of history back then was a little bit different from our conception of history today, in that history back then was sort of mixed with legend and stories, and that, Livy was, in a sense, kind of writing a patriotic history of Rome, rather than, totally 100% objective, just because, all history has its own bias. All history writing has its own bias, and not every historian has 100% objective judgment and 100% access to the information preceding him.
Right.
But it's also possible that we just, we also have the benefit of archaeology and hindsight. And
Yes.
We can kind of look into our sources a little bit more with a critical eye and say, well, the 7 kings of Rome were probably more mythical than actual, or there could be some historical basis to that time period, the Roman kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
The Roman kingdom, of course, came before the Republic.
Romulus and Remus.
Yeah. Yes. And of
Nursed
course,
by a she-wolf.
yes. Yeah. The founding myth of Rome, the twin brothers of Romulus and Remus.
Which we see maybe a little bit of that in Elros and in Elrond. Maybe.
Yeah, except they didn't kill each other. Romulus.
Well, it turned out good this time.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so I think the main thing, like you said before, Anthony, is just that because he read history and he was familiar with the history of Rome, of a long civilization that developed over time, he had the tools kind of to be able to create cultures in his writings that had the appearance of great age,
Yeah. And of waning and waxing, I think, too.
For sure. And we see that with Numenor as well. I mean, even though they had maybe more of an, referring to the Egyptians who also waxed and waned,
Yeah, waxing.
But when I look at the Romans, they had such innovation, right? They created so many good things.
Yeah, and the Greeks too.
And the Greeks too. That's true. Yeah. I don't think of the Egyptians as great innovators as much, but I guess in a way they were.
Yeah.
For their time. Yeah.
But
Okay.
weren't the Greeks actually Romans technical experts for the longest time.
I wouldn't doubt that. That makes sense to me, but I'm not as well versed in that.
Yeah, well, I mean, Rome took so much from Greek culture and technology and stuff that.
Well, I think these are actually Greeks
Yeah,
that were employed by the Romans.
yeah. Trying to think of one.
That's all Greek to me.
It's all Greek tea. Yeah, can you think of an example?
You see, Archimedes, you say is Greek.
Oh yes.
Yeah, I mean,
shipbuilding.
yeah, he would have lived when Rome would have started its conquest around the Greek Mediterranean.
Yeah.
I think he was he? I think he was killed by Roman soldiers. But well, like take Galen for example. He was a Greek. I think he lived in the Roman Empire, but he was a Greek writer.
Okay.
He was considered the father of medicine.
That's right. Okay, well, let's go ahead and move on, if you don't mind, to the Aeneid.
Yeah, sure.
Virgil. So now we have a later writer looking up what the dates are on Virgil. He's a little bit later, isn't he, than Livy?
Actually, a little bit earlier. He would have.
I see. He died in 19 BC.
Yes.
Okay, so he's really still in that Republican time period of the Republic.
Yeah. Well.
Or the Senate, rather. Pre-emperor.
Yeah. Well, I believe. Well, Augustus became Princeps Maximus, or the what we now call emperor, in I want to say 27 BC or something. So it would have been around the time of the early empire when the Aeneid was written. And it would have been written, in the court, to be sort of performed, maybe perhaps by Virgil himself in the court of Augustus.
Oh, okay. So he was actually in the court.
Yeah, but it's interesting in that the poem was technically he finished the poem, but he didn't necessarily complete it, or he didn't finish editing it. Before he died, he wished the manuscript of his poem to be burnt, but his contemporaries ignored his wishes and decided to publish it. And so now we have, his sort of magnum opus, the Aeneid,
Right.
which talks about, again, another sort of mythical founding of Rome by Aeneas, who is a sort of a veteran of the Trojan War. The poem starts out with Aeneas and his Trojan companions.
Can everybody hear Anthony?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, please give us a little bit of a synopsis of it.
Sure. So the poem starts out with Aeneas and his Trojan companions being sort of at sea, but then Juno, the goddess Juno, who I think is the Hera in the Greek pantheon, she has this sort of resentment against them for some reason. I think because they're Trojans and she's a Greek goddess. I could go into more details, but basically they kind of, I think she goes to Aeolus, the wind god, to try to destroy their ship at sea, but they survive and wash up on the shores of, I believe, Carthage, which was a North African kingdom in ancient times. And at Carthage, Carthage at the time is ruled by Dido, who's the queen. Dido sort of falls in love with Aeneas, but he kind of rebuffs her advances, and I think she basically ends up throwing herself onto a big pyre of flame.
Oh, wow.
In effect, killing herself because she was rejected by Aeneas, because Aeneas feels more of a duty to sort of fulfill his destiny as the founder of Rome. And so Aeneas continues onward to Italy, and I could go into more detail about it.
No, I just want to make a comment. So I was reading here that unfortunately some lines of the poem were left unfinished and the whole was unedited at Virgil's death.
Yeah.
And I thought, that sounds like Tolkien.
I know, right? Yeah, so... And also Virgil wrote some other poems too, namely the Eclogues and the Georgics, which were more pastoral-like poems, sort of idealizing the agricultural lifestyle. but that's sort of a digression. But I could go into the the summary of the rest of the Aeneid, but I've kind of forgotten.
That's
Since
fine.
I haven't read this since college, and
Wow. Good for you. I don't think I ever had to read it for college, and I
Yeah.
wish I had, because
Yeah.
I wish I had a greater grasp of it. Anybody else has read it? The Aeneid?
Well, I mean, that's about the Battle of Troy, right?
The Trojan War was.
Yeah.
The Trojan War. And one of the things that getting back to what I said before about Plato and possibly because there's a 1,200 year time lapse between when Thera collapsed under the volcano and Plato did. I'm just wondering if how much of truth there was in some of these ancient myths. Because I remember a German archaeologist called Smial,
Yeah.
Heinrich Smial,
Yeah.
who discovered that Troy did exist in the late 19th century.
Yeah.
It actually existed. So I don't know, and of course, how much of the Trojan War was accurate, or I don't know.
Yeah. Actually.
I don't know if the Achilles actually lived.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating.
Absolutely, yeah. There's actually a book by Barry Strauss, who's a classicist, called The Trojan War, and it's about the sort of the historical basis for the Trojan War and how the Trojan War might have actually existed between or happened between
Yeah.
two Bronze Age kingdoms.
Yep.
It could have been, the Greeks versus the Hittites, actually, who basically inhabited modern day Turkey.
Yep.
So, yeah, it's really fascinating how some of these myths could have actually had a historical basis.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm pretty sure that you can discover. You can go to the archaeological site of Troy,
Yeah.
and so you can see what that's like. But for sure, the tale grows in the telling.
Yes. As
Yeah.
Tolkien was saying.
I would like to make a quick reference to the Aeneid. Again, I was listening to the Prancing Pony podcast, and currently, so Alan Sisto and his co-hosts are reading through The Return of the King.
Mm-hmm.
They read actually through 6 years ago when they started the Silmarillion, and then read The Hobbit, and now they're reading through the Lord of the Rings, and have already finished The Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers. So they're currently reading The Return of the King and are up to the Siege of Gondor. But there's this great part I want to mention here where they had a nice catch here. They were talking about how when Pippin, if you recall, was in the city of Minas Tirith and had become, after speaking to Denethor, had become one of the guards there. He was able to go and talk to this man Baragond, and Baragond said, "Would you go and you can find my son Burgo, near the gate." And so Pippin basically spends time with Burgo, and it's an interesting kind of interaction where they watch from the wall. They watch out onto the plain, and they actually get a chance to kind of go outside the gate as the last groups of soldiers come in from different parts of Gondor for the defense of Minas Tirith. And I just want to quote a small section. This is from the chapter called Minas Tirith, and chapter 1, and it's towards the end, and it's only a few pages from the end, starting at the new section where it says, "And so the companies came and were hailed and cheered and passed through the gate, men of the outlands marching to defend the city of Gondor in a dark hour, but always too few, always less than hope looked for or need asked. The men of Ringlow Vale behind the son of their lord, Dervorin striding on foot, 300s, From the uplands of Morthon, the great Blackroot Vale, tall Dwinhir with his sons, Dwelin and Derufin, and 500 bowmen. From the Anfalas, the Langstrand far away, a long line of men of many sorts, hunters and herdsmen and men of little villages, scantily equipped save for the household of Galaskil their lord. And he mentions several others, and then Imrahil, prince of Dol Amroth, who comes with his knights, bearing his token of the ship and the silver swan.
Yeah.
And the reference was that this is very similar to how Virgil in his Aeneid there is a section where it quotes men with their ships, and I don't know what section it's in, but it has to do with as each of the ships came, and it was the captain of the ship and the name of their ship, and it was this kind of catalog right before a war.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a certain kind of, it's not a trope, but it's like a certain kind of literary device where, you're kind of, in a sense, stacking the names of these people that are supposed to be, you're just given a hint. These are people of renown from different places coming in. And that's kind of a neat little connection there to the Aeneid. And obviously Tolkien not only had read these, but is using some of the same sorts of literary devices to give us a sense of the power, or in this case, the lack of power, because they're only able to send small amounts, because the southern part of Gondor is defending against, they're trying to protect their land from the corsairs of Umbar, and so it's more looking hopeless because they don't have, they're only getting really like 3,000 reinforcements, and they were hoping for much, much more. And of course, they still at this point don't know if the Rohirrim will be able to come. So it's an exciting part of the story, and you can, if you want to join in with them, you can read along as they discuss the chapter. They don't read all of it for copyright purposes, but they read sections and then they discuss it on the podcast. So I thought that was really interesting. Any other comment on the Aeneid? I'll learn to say that, Anthony.
Yeah, you got it.
What you just talked about, Brian, Peter Jackson, adopted for the Rohirrim. Because, not as many came.
Right.
Who joined with him. And, their quest to unleash or undo the siege of Gondor.
That's a great catch. I hadn't thought about that, because you're right. It's not mentioned. He doesn't do that with Gondor, does he? Because he doesn't have. We don't have Baragon. We don't have Burgil. But with the Rohirrim, when they have the muster of Rohan, not as many come as he's expected.
Yeah.
And so that's right. So Jackson kind of relocates that. That's kind of a clever way of including that in there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, well, so our next writer in antiquity is
Augusta?
Ovid, actually.
Oh, Ovid, yeah.
Ovid. So the Metamorphoses, what was the reference there, Anthony? I'm not really sure.
Oh, well, I put Ovid in there because, he wrote his main work. He wrote a lot of poetry, but his main work is the Metamorphoses. And Metamorphoses comes from the Greek word meaning metamorphosis, which means change. So it's really, a book of poetry on change, or changes. And the Metamorphoses, sort of like Homer and Hesiod, are one of our primary sources for classical mythology. In that, within the Metamorphoses, contains a lot of stories about the Greco-Roman gods and goddesses, and like, for example, the story of Icarus being, getting his wings clipped off, and Phaeton, who's, I think,
Phaeton, yeah.
Yeah, Phaeton, the son of Apollo,
Right.
trying to race his chariot across the sky, but it ends up getting burned down by the power of the sun.
Yep.
And so, sort of like before, I sort of included that as because even if Tolkien didn't explicitly acknowledge Ovid, he might have, he might have not. I don't know, but the sense of myth and mythology, certainly the gravity of storytelling sort of pervades all of Tolkien's work.
Say that again. What?
the sense of
fading
gravity,
of gravity.
seriousness, I guess.
So you see that? So that would be one way in which Ovid could possibly have an influence on Tolkien.
Yeah, or the grandeur of myth is probably the way.
Grandeur myth, yes. I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I think that's why it feels timeless. Why does Tolkien appeal to so many different people? And could it be because he was steeped in stories that had been around for a long, long time, that were themselves timeless in the sense that they had a lot of popularity for centuries, and so he's writing in ways that perhaps capture that sense of grandeur that, frankly, is pretty missing anywhere else. I mean, it's, people are kind of tired of how things are so banal, so kind of just inconsequential and petty.
Yeah.
So that's why we love his stories. Okay, well, I had nothing else on that. Although maybe we should say that Tolkien does actually include quite a bit of poetry in his stories,
Right.
especially in the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. And also, the Metamorphoses itself was sort of written in a poetic fashion. And, Tolkien wrote in the collection, The Lays of Beleriand. His a book in which is collected some of Tolkien's tales written in poetic form concerning Beleriand. First Age, like
Right.
the Lay of Lythian, the Tale of Beren Luthien. There's a fragment called the Lay of the Fall of Gondolin, and
Right.
so, yeah, myth and poetry, I think, were two huge facets of Tolkien's work that were heavily influenced by the Greeks and the Romans, and eventually the Anglo-Saxons and the Norse.
Yeah. Yeah, and may I say, and I'd love to hear Chris's comments on this, how illiterate we are when it comes to the classics now. And I would ask both Chris's comment and Gary, both of you. But I appreciate, Anthony, how you're well read.
Thank you.
But I feel like that's really rare.
Yeah.
Nowadays, I just feel like we're losing. It's not. Yeah. There's just. I don't want to go on and on about this, but I do feel like Tolkien had. Probably his generation was the last one that assumed that everybody should know the classics.
Yeah.
And from that time period on, by the 60s and 70s, education has started to change enough and move away from all that.
And in the classical Christian education model that my kids are under, they more likely than not are going to be more well-read than I was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Certainly at the time of the age of 18. Certainly I did read books, I consumed a whole bunch of books, but they were fantasy and not the sources.
Yeah.
And so that is where I hope that my children will have a better base and perhaps a better appreciation for some of these things. But it also gives me an opportunity to read some of this stuff with them and pick it up as well. And like correcting Vera's tests, history tests. It's like, really? That happened? And then I have to go find out for myself. So it has been a wonderful process, and I welcomed my children just steeping in the classics. They're They're not quite there yet, but they're getting there.
Right. Gary, what was your experience of education like when you were growing up? Were you
Better than today.
Yeah.
I went to elementary school in the 50s and high school in the 60s and did a year at college at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Finally got a degree in overseas through University of Maryland. But it was not as comprehensive as the previous generations. And I think the salient point in history was World War I.
Ah,
Which if you look at it and when that started and everything like that, was really stupid.
yep.
And it led to World War II and
Yeah.
it led to the problems we
So much
suffered
suffering.
throughout the last century, maybe a little bit into this. But that's where the downward trend went. And one thing I noticed about Tolkien and of course C.S. Lewis and probably some of the other Englands, they were not buying into the really depression of the times. When I'm talking like E. Cummings and who wrote The Hollow Men?
Oh, T.S. Eliot.
T.S. Eliot.
T.S. Eliot. We Are the Hollow Men. Everything was not worth anything at the time. And
Yeah.
how they felt and their life was just meaningless. And that's kind of where I believe it all started. And it's been, like I said, downhill ever since. But in the 60s, it's also because of you got the Vietnam War and a lot of the folks who were teaching who were against it, and then they recruited similar type people. And again, they have no time for classics, which is unfortunate because, for a well-rounded education, you really need that. So,
Well, it
that's
seems
the thoughts on that.
seems like a false dilemma because that whole idea of kind of turning away from the past and saying, well, we need to be reading more widely in different cultures or thinking about now. It's like, why does it have to be a choice between the classics and contemporary writing? To me it seems like, can it be both and where we could still have maybe a better grasp of the classics and what's influenced Western civilization, because that just seems wise to understand our roots.
Yeah.
And there's still so many parallels. I find this, as a student of the Bible, I find it really interesting, kind of intriguing how in a post-Christian world, or at least in the West, there's still a lot of references, by the skin of your teeth is from Job.
Yeah.
And there's just lots and lots of examples I won't go on about. But things that are actually from the Bible, but not many people realize that. Or even if you were to go as recent as Shakespeare, I mean, that's fairly recent comparatively. People don't necessarily know where these things come from. So I think it's great to have that background. But on the other hand, it's good to read widely and be open to new things too.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you could. Oh, go ahead. Gary, were you going to say something?
I was just saying, yeah, I agree with you. But I think with current academia, there's been a rejection of Western culture. And, I mean, they, I don't know what you can do about that other than, fight it head on, I guess. Or, limit resources you have.
Form new institutions, that's how you're going to do it.
Yeah, well, yeah, I agree there, Bruce.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely a proponent of, in the case of, cultural learning, having your cake and eating it too. On the one hand, you can learn about your own culture through reading, in our case, since we're Western Europeans, we can read the classics.
Right.
But also, I think we should also be open to learning about other cultures as well, and try to be, cultural learners, because, there are some, even though there are some differences between our culture and many other cultures, there might be some similarities too, and I think
Sure.
that kind of makes for a more rich experience.
Yep. You can always find the everyman. You look for ways in which that can connect, and certainly we even see in the Middle Ages a fusion between classical or the Greco-Roman influence, the Mediterranean on the one hand, and the Northern European kind of traditions as well. So
Yeah.
Europe itself really is a product of the fusion of these two things. So I do think, and of course we live in the United States of America, and we're not Greeks or Romans. I mean, a lot of the classics are for us also a cultural experience.
Yeah.
To understand, to learn about the context, to read it, to go back to a time. And maybe that's not that different than reading stories, if they're well written, from another place, not a different time. And we still have the opportunity to kind of imagine, and by reading, we are able to go somewhere else. That's the power of literature, I think.
Yeah.
So, and I think too, it's sad if you think that you have to tear something down in order to make things better. I think it's far better to say, why don't we build on what was already there?
Yeah.
And of course, we can have a good critical eye, constructive criticism, and recognize, hey, what's a good part of it, what's a bad part of it, and then how can we be hopeful about building onto it. So I feel like in order to understand somebody like Tolkien, what we're doing today is really valuable, because without that, we're missing part of him.
Yeah.
There's that famous conversation. I know that some of you are familiar with this, in which Tolkien talked about how when C.S. Lewis died,
Oh yeah.
right? And I think it was a reference to when Charles Williams died, that part of Jack was gone also. I can't remember who he was referring to. I always mess this one up. Chris, do you remember? But it's the Inklings, and it's this idea. Yeah. Is that familiar to you?
I
Well, anyway, I'm botching it, but
I'm trying to remember, and I don't remember exactly the phrase that you're.
So what I'm getting at here is, what if that could be true? What if there's a parallel historically, where we're not sitting in the same room as Virgil and Livy and Ovid, but at the same time we're still having a conversation.
Yeah.
We're still listening to these writers. We're thinking about it. We're kind of accepting some things, rejecting others. We're inspired or whatever. Tolkien was influenced by these writers, and to the extent that we're ignorant of them, we're maybe ignorant of how that connects to Tolkien.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is, maybe knowing the classics, for example, is helpful in understanding later writers.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be one argument for why I think it's still important to learn at least some of the classics. So, yeah. Anyway. Okay, well, it's almost 2:30, so I want to make sure that we get to Augustine, because he's just a giant in building on kind of really we're talking the late Roman period.
Yeah.
He's called an early church father, but he could also be considered a late Roman writer in a way, couldn't he?
Yes.
So, Anthony, what thoughts do you have about Augustine? And we have two kind of works that he wrote that you've got on this Google Docs here.
Oh, sure.
And those would be?
Well, he wrote many works.
Is this the same as what I have heard of Augustine?
Yes.
Yeah. I think. Yeah, Augustine, Augustine, tomato, tomato, potato, whatever. But I pronounce it as Augustine. So.
I think Augustine would be more like the Latin way of saying it.
Yeah, his Latin name was Aurelius Augustinus.
Yeah, Augustinus. So it's the emphasis would be more following the old Latin way.
Yeah.
And Augustine is an easier, what seems more ready to our minds, because it's in English, you almost never almost never have the stress on the last syllable.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas in a lot of other languages, they do have that stress on the last
Right.
syllable, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Like in Spanish, it's more common.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, Augustine was born Aurelius Augustinus, I believe, in 354 A.D. Yes, I know, I'm a history nerd, like Brian. So Augustine came from a town called Thagast in Roman North Africa, which would be modern-day Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco. So he was North African by birth, and he wasn't originally born a Christian. He was a pagan. You can read his autobiography of the Confessions as the Confessions is actually probably the world's first autobiography in the Western tradition, within it he kind of goes into really more than just his life story. It's kind of his spiritual conversion from first from paganism to Manichaeism, which was kind of another type of belief system where
Kind of influenced by Zoroastrianism, wasn't it? Sort
yeah,
of.
Zoroastrianism, where
Kind of
there's two diametrically opposing opposites of good and evil, and that life is always a tension between those two, and so on.
Basically,
and so
Star Wars.
forth. That's it. Yeah, kind of. Yeah. Well, except in Star Wars, good wins out in the end.
That's right.
Manichaeism, there's always this tension between good and evil in one's heart. But anyways,
So he converts from that.
yeah. So one day, Augustine was in the garden of one of his friends, and he had this sort of vision or voice in his head telling him, in Latin, it's tolle et lege, which means take and read, take and read. And he thought it was just some sort of voice was telling him to just pick out a random passage in the Bible. He did that, and I forget what verse it is. I think it comes from the book of Psalms. And this experience made such an impression on him that he decided to, gradually convert to Christianity and kind of renounce his previously sinful ways, because he had a mistress. He also had a son by this mistress named Adeodatus. Can you imagine a kid running around today with the name Adeodatus? Yeah. I think the influence of his mother, Monica, was also important, because I think his mother was a Christian as well.
Yes, she was. His father was a pagan, but his mother was a...
Yeah, and also Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, was sort of his spiritual guide or mentor as well.
Mm-hmm.
So eventually, Augustine converted to Christianity at approximately age 32.
It was the book to the Romans. It was
Okay.
St. Paul's letter to the Romans.
Okay.
Yeah. That's just amazing life, though, right? I mean, this guy was trained by some of the best orators, and
Yeah, that's right. His background was that he was basically a teacher of rhetoric,
that's it.
and eventually became one of the church's greatest theologians, Catholic Church. And from the time he became a Christian, he started writing a lot of philosophical and theological tracts, of which sort of what he considered his magnum opus to be was De Civitate Dei contra Paganos, or
Wow.
on the City of God against the Pagans,
Right.
which was written as a reaction or a defense of Christianity against the sack of Rome by the Vandals, led by Alaric.
Not to be confused with the University of Idaho.
Yeah, yeah, and in 410 A.D.
What a huge shock to the Roman Empire, right?
Yes, it was a hugely traumatizing event, and Augustine kind of wanted to mount a defense or a work of apologetics against pagans, or essentially people who were following the old Greco-Roman gods, who kind of blamed Christianity for the
Right.
evils that befell the Roman Empire.
That's what they would have said, right? That
Yeah.
the reason why this happened is because we abandoned the old gods.
Yeah, and, Christianity was causing a lot of instability within the Roman Empire, essentially. Yeah, I've read some of it. It's a massive tome. This is an
It
abridged
is.
copy. The original is like over 1,000 pages. This
Wow.
one's like 500.
You know when they abridge something and it's still 500 pages?
Yeah.
That was long.
Yeah.
How about you, Gary or Chris? Have you read anything by Augustine?
I have not. It is on my to-do 2023 list because Vera starts in on some of that stuff next year.
And I have not read anything other than, hearing his name in church and places like that, St. Augustine or St.
Yep.
Augustine. I do remember though, and I don't know if you folks will think it's funny or not, but I don't know if when he converted to Christianity, if he converted completely all at once with all his heart, because there's the famous quote attributed to him that says, "Lord, give me chastity, but not all at once."
Yeah, not yet, he
Yeah.
said. Yes.
Yeah, grant me chastity and continence, O Lord, but not yet.
Yes. Yeah, it was certainly.
I do know his reputation.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And he ranks right up there with St. Aquinas.
Yeah, Thomas Aquinas. Yeah.
That's right. I mean, you've got basically somebody who would be like a Don Juan combined with an intellectual philosopher
Yeah.
who then is converted. I have read Confessions. I have not read City of God, but Confessions is pretty readable.
Yeah.
It's not as long. It's autobiographical, which is I think a little easier to get into. And I would definitely recommend it. It's like my copy that you can pick up. I think this is a Penguin paperback.
Yeah.
And this is only like 300 pages, so it's very doable.
Yeah.
It's very good. I enjoy it. I'd recommend the Confessions. And I'll say Augustine for you, Gary.
That's just how I've heard it all my life. So.
Well, and I think in Florida, it's St. Augustine, Florida,
I
isn't
think
it?
it is, yeah.
Yeah. Which is the oldest continuously inhabited city in North America.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I guess the question we need to ask is, what connections do we see between this writer and Tolkien? What I mean, obviously his Christian faith, as opposed to say Virgil or Ovid, who presumably would have been, upstanding pagans and burned incense to the emperor or whatever. So, is it just his faith that Tolkien shared that we see the influence, or is it maybe something bigger than that?
Well, Augustine, I don't think, wrote any fiction as far as I know, or we know. But, Augustine, certainly his outlook, his worldview, as seen in Confessions and the City of God, had a huge influence on the subsequent development of the Christian Church, or the Catholic Church, and really the Middle Ages as a whole. I think in one of Tolkien's letters, Tolkien talks about just that, the importance of, or really just how man has sort of fallen from a state of purity, as seen in like the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and that man is sort of tainted with original sin. And I think these are all ideas that can be found certainly in Augustine.
For sure.
And
Yeah, that's a good catch.
yeah.
Yeah, and I was just thinking too about how that concept that everything is good in the beginning, but if it's corrupted, it's evil itself is not. Like going back to this really fascinating phase of his life, that Augustine struggled. He for some time believed in Manichaeism, so he had that kind of dualism in mind. But he changed radically from that. In that, as a Christian, he no longer believed in that kind of permanent kind of these things are evil, things are bad. I mean, Augustine gets a bad rap a little bit for his view on concupiscence, which is just hard to say.
Concupiscence, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So, which one of you was it that? Is the grammar Anthony got me there. But it was just, that, obviously we can look back and then say, well, they didn't have a very wholesome view of sex or whatever. They influenced by a kind of a Neoplatonist view, of matter. But actually, I think Augustine, as much as he was influenced by that, he would have been very aware of that, of kind of a Gnostic tendency towards denying the material or whatever, or seeing material things as somehow inherently bad. And I think that Augustine would have said, no, I used to believe that, but not anymore. So the world, the creation is good, everything is good, people inherently are good. However, there is corruption. There is original sin. He believed that there was the sense in which something had been lost. And so it's kind of like the grandeur there is that everything has this beautiful root, but that it's been vandalized. I think of that statue at the crossroads of Osgiliath. It's the crossroads between Osgiliath and Minas Ithil, right, or Minas Morgul.
Yeah.
And there's that part where Frodo and Sam are walking along with Gollum, and they come there on the last day of sunlight, before the clouds completely cover the whole sky and keep it permanently dim. And he sees this just last rays of light falling on this statue, which is headless. The orcs have knocked the head off this and it would have been a Gondorian or Numenorian, kind of statue. But the head of the king is crowned with flowers.
Yeah.
And I always just think of that as a beautiful kind of, almost like Augustine, this idea of here's humanity, like the statue, noble, full of dignity, and power, and potential, but because of temptation and sin, the head, as it were, the authority, the influence, the goodness, has been knocked off. Things are askew. There's even the orcs, on that, they had scrawled some kind of orcish graffiti. That's kind of this world, as Augustine saw it, and yet there is hope. There is the potential of eucatastrophe. There is some possibility, because when Sam and Frodo see that head of the king wreathed with flowers in the light, it's just this it's maybe not going to always be this way, right?
Yeah, of course, yeah, and I think that leads me to what I was wanting to say, which was, I think both Augustine and Plato and Tolkien himself would have considered this earthly existence, even though it can be both corrupt and perhaps beautiful, as sort of an imperfect copy of really the true life, which is sort of up in heaven.
Eternal life.
Yeah, eternal life, yeah. And which can be seen, I think, also in, the Valinor and the Undying Lands.
Yes.
And just sort of being with Iluvatar and the Valar. And I think that's how many Christians conceive of heaven, as just being one with God, or sort of reuniting with God after this corporeal existence that we live through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's good. Those are good points. Thank you, Anthony.
Yeah.
Gary or Chris, any comments before we move on? We have a little time that we could read a letter of Tolkien to kind of finish up our time. But any last comments on Augustine or Augustine? Istanbul, Constantinople.
When I hear somebody say St. Augustine for the city in Florida.
Maybe you're right. Maybe it is St. Augustine, Florida.
I don't know.
I'm not sure.
I've never heard of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, Tolkien stood on shoulders, didn't he?
Yeah, he stood on the shoulders of giants,
Indeed.
as Nathan said.
Yes. Okay, well, let's go ahead. I think we have a little time left, so if you don't mind, let's go ahead and try to finish things out with two things left. One would be reading letters of Tolkien, and then the other thing would be we need to discuss about when we're meeting, so remind me please about that. So, okay, so letter 212 of Tolkien is where we are. Gary or Chris, would one of you like to take a turn reading a paragraph or two, and then we can maybe go around?
I gotta go get my book.
You guys read letter 211 took up how many pages? Jeez.
A lot.
And 212 is, I just opened it here, is a continuation of the letter to,
Yeah, it's a draft.
Yeah. Part 2. But never sent.
Oh my God. Okay.
Do you wanna-
It's not quite as long.
Do you want to take a turn, Gary?
Yeah, I'll take a turn, get my reading glasses on. Draft, draft the continuation of the above letter not sent. So it's never sent. Oh, this was never sent, 212 was sent. Okay. Anyway, since I've written so much, in parentheses, I hope not too much. Let go add a few lines of the myth which always sounded, since it may make clear the relations of valor, elves, men, Sauron, wizards, etc. Valor, the powers, rulers, for the first creation, rational spirits of mind without incarnation, created the physical world. Strictly, these spirits were called Ainur, the valor being only those from among them who entered the world after its making. And the name is probably applied only to the great among them who take the imaginative, but not the theological place of gods. The Ainur took part in the making of the world as sub-creators in various degrees. After this fashion, they interpreted according to their powers and completed in detail the design propounded to them by the one. This was propounded first in musical or abstract form, and then in historical vision, In the first interpretation of the vast music of the Ainur, Melkor introduced alterations, not interpretations of the mind and one, and great discord arose. The one then presented this music, including the apparent discords, as a visible history.
Wow. So remember, this is before the Silmarillion was published. You know, this is really the first glimpse. You know, these are the little things that he's dropping here and there in his letters that really anybody knows. I mean, Christopher Tolkien would have known, but a lot of people did not have all that background.
No. We're kind of lucky.
For sure.
Okay. At this stage, it had still only a validity to which the validity of the story among other themselves may be compared. It exists in the mind of the teller and derivatively the minds of hearers, but not at the same plane as tellers or hearers. When the one, the teller, said let it be, the tale became history, on the same plane as the hearers. These could, if they desire, enter into it. Many of the Ainur did enter into it and must abide in it to the end, being involved in time, a series of events that completed it. These were the valor, their lesser attendants. There were those who had fallen in love with the vision, and no doubt were those who had played the most sub-creative, or as we might say, artistic art and music.
You know what this reminds me of is jazz.
Oh.
Because I was just thinking about with jazz, you have a certain sense in which you're jamming, right? You're essentially adding your own, like somebody starts, but then so the next person who enters is not going to, you know, bring in a discordant, like totally different tune, but they're going to be riffing and they're going to be improvising. Thank you. Yeah. So I feel like obviously that's not what Tolkien was thinking here, but I think that is an example of how you can imagine this kind of thing happening.
Kind of building up.
Yeah, I mean, if the Valar were playing jazz, yeah.
We got Manway on drums.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure that Morgoth had a saxophone.
Or a trombone.
Maybe trombone.
Playing the wrong notes.
Yep. You want to keep reading?
Music.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
Do you want to keep reading, or do you want to pass it on? Okay.
It was because of their love of, how do you pronounce it?
Ea.
Ea.
Yeah. And because of the part they had played in its making, that they wished to and could incarnate themselves in physical forms, though these were comparable to our clothes. And so far as our clothes are our personal expression, not to our bodies. Their forms are thus expressions of their persons, powers, and loves. They need not be anthropomorphic. And appearance, Yavana, wife of Apollo, would, for instance, appear in the form of a great tree. But the habitual shapes of the valor, when visible or clothed, were anthropomorphic, because of their intense concern with the elves and men.
Man, this is so interesting. Chris, any comments on that?
Not really.
I did not realize that Yavanna could appear in the form of a great tree. That's the first I've ever heard of that before.
I think Tolkien does mention Yavanna as being sort of like a goddess of nature and
She is.
nurturing and life-giving. Yeah.
For sure, but I didn't think of her like, hey, if you went to go see Yavanna, she might be like, oh, where's Yavanna? Oh no, that tree,
Yeah.
that's actually Yavanna, you know?
Might be an ant wife.
Exactly.
That'd be funny.
Yeah, because the Ents were her creation, weren't they?
Yeah, but I think it brings up to another point, which is like when I read the Silmarillion, especially the parts dealing with the Valaquenta and the gods, you know, it's hard for me to conceive of them as sort of incorporeal or something that's so totally different from our normal conceptions of beings, right?
Yeah.
So like I always imagine like them adopting human forms, which
Sure.
is what Tolkien talks about here in this letter when they sort of habitually adopt human forms in dealings with elves and men. Like, for
Yep.
example, I think of Ulmo as sort of resembling Poseidon, for example,
Yeah.
or some sort of water elemental. And or I think of Manwë as sort of like this big, sort of grand, tall stature, man of tall stature, and of Yavanna as
Oh, he's such a
tall.
windbag, though.
Yeah, true. And I think of Tolkas as just sort of like this great warrior, and
And then Arome on his horse.
yeah,
right?
so Orome the hunter, yeah, and Aule sort of being the forger,
Right.
blacksmith, yeah.
Right.
So,
Well, in order to ride his horse, Arome must have been man-size or whatever, right?
oh yeah,
Because the horses that he rode were the ancestors of the Maoras, I thought.
I don't know. I think you're right about that.
Sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Oh no. I was just going to conclude by saying that I think similarly with how the Greeks and Romans conceived their gods. I think if we go into the actual, if we considered elves and men sort of trying to conceive of the gods, they couldn't think of them other than what they themselves sort of resembled. You know what I'm saying? Like or even in Christian, in the Christian Bible, Hebrew Christian Bible, how man was created in God's image, and that a lot of us think of God as some of us even today still think of God as sort of this great big bearded white man
Yeah.
in the sky.
Yeah.
Of course, that's a simple oversimplification. But
Yeah, that's a flawed. Yeah, because we fill in the blanks with things that are not always helpful,
yeah,
right?
we try to anthropomorphize the ineffable.
Ineffable. Good word there.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Wow. You gotta use that word more often.
oh, I do.
That's good. Yeah. Something so great, and I think that majesty does communicate that, doesn't he? A little bit in the. So if you've read the Aino Lindale and then the Valaquenta, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Valaquenta would be the main source of a lot of information we have about them.
Yeah, the Valar.
Yeah. And of course, you get the hint of the Maiar here, don't you? The servants,
Yes.
the lesser beings that go with them. So,
Like.
do you want to read next, or Chris?
Oh sure. Chris, you can go ahead. I talk too much.
We're on elves and men, Chris.
Yes. Elves and men were called the children of God because they were, so to speak, a private addition to the design by the Creator, and one in which the Valar had no part. Their themes were introduced into the music of the One when the discords of Melkor arose. The Valar knew that they would appear, and the Great Ones knew when and how, though not precisely, but they knew little of their nature and their foresight derived from the pre-knowledge of the design. Was imperfect or failed in the matter of the deeds of the children. The uncorrupted Valar, therefore, yearned for the children before they came and loved them afterwards, as creatures other than themselves, independent of them and their artistry. Children, as being weaker and more ignorant than the Valar, but of equal lineage, deriving being direct from the One, even though under the authority as rulers of Arda. The corrupted, as was Melkor, Morgoth, and his followers, of whom Saruman was one of the chief, saw in them the ideal material for subjects and slaves, to whom they could become masters as gods, and envying the children and secretly hating them, in proportion as they became rebels against the One, and man weighed his position in Ea. So, yeah, there's some influences there. You know, the concept of angelic beings in Scripture having more power than men, and the children of God comment there is also not just scriptural, but also comes from Greek and Norse myths as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You want to read again, or?
Yep.
Okay.
So in this mythical prehistory, immortality, strictly longevity coextensive with the life of Arda, was part of the given nature of the elves. Beyond the end, nothing was revealed. Mortality, that is the short lifespan, having no relation to the life of Arda, is spoken as the given nature of men. The elves called it the gift of Ilúvatar, God. But it must be remembered that mythically these tales are elf-centered. In narrative, as soon as the matter became storial and not mythical, being in fact human literature, the center of interest must shift to men and their relations with elves and other creatures. We cannot write stories about elves whom we do not know inwardly. And if we try, we simply turn elves into men. There's an anthropomorphization, not anthropocentric. And men only appear in them at what must be a point long after their coming. This is therefore an elvish view, and does not necessarily have anything to say for or against such beliefs as the Christian, that death is not part of human nature, but a punishment for sin or rebellion, a result of the fall. It should be regarded as an elvish perception of what death, not being tied to the circles of the world, should now become for men, however it arose. A divine punishment is also a divine gift, if accepted, since its object is ultimate blessing, and the supreme inventiveness of the Creator will make punishments, that is, changes of designs, produce good not otherwise to be attained. a mortal man has probably, an elf would say, a higher, if unrelated, destiny than a longevity one. To attempt by device or magic to recover longevity is thus supreme folly and the wickedness of mortals. Longevity or counterfeit immortality, true immortality is beyond Ea, is the chief bait of Sauron. It leads the Smial to a golem, and the great to a ringwraith.
Let's let Anthony read a paragraph or so, and then I can finish up. Once
Okay.
you're done, I'll finish up the letter.
Sure. In the Elvish legends, there is record of a strange case of an elf, Miriel, mother of Feanor, that tried to die, which had disastrous results, leading to the, quote, fall of the High Elves. The elves were not subject to disease, but they could be, quote, slain, that is, their bodies could be destroyed or mutilated so as to be unfit to sustain life. But this did not naturally lead to death. They were rehabilitated and reborn, and eventually recovered memory of all their past. They remained identical, but Muriel wished to abandon being and refused rebirth. There's a footnote that says 1, the eldest alone, and 6 more with 6 mates. Wow. Anyways, I suppose the difference between this myth and what may be perhaps called Christian mythology is this. In the latter, the fall of man is subsequent to and a consequence, though not a necessary consequence, of the fall of the angels, a rebellion of created free will at a higher level than man. But it is not clearly held, and in many versions is not held at all, that this affected the world and its nature. Evil was brought in from outside by Satan. Wow. In this myth, the rebellion of created free will precedes creation of the world, Ea, and Ea has in it subcreatively introduced evil, rebellions, discordant elements of its own nature already when the "let it be" was spoken. The fall or corruption, therefore, of all things in it and all inhabitants of it was a possibility, if not inevitable. Trees may, quote, go bad, as in the old forest. Elves may turn into orcs. And if this required the special perversive malice of Morgoth, still elves themselves could do evil deeds. Even the good Valars inhabiting the world could at least err, as the great Valar did in their dealings with the elves. Or as the lesser of their kind, as the Istari, or wizards, could in various ways become self-seeking. Aule, for instance, one of the great, in a sense fell, for he so desired to see the children that he became impatient and tried to anticipate the will of the Creator. Being the greatest of all craftsmen, he tried to make children according to his imperfect knowledge of their kind. When he had made 13, which I believe are the fathers of the dwarves, God spoke to him in anger, but not without pity, for Aule had done this thing not out of evil desire to have slaves and subjects of his own, but out of impatient love, desiring children to talk to and teach, sharing with them the praise of Iluvatar and his great love of the materials of which the world is made.
The one rebuked Aule, saying that he had tried to usurp the Creator's power, but he could not give independent life to his makings. He had only one life, his own, derived from the one, and could at most only distribute it. Behold, said the one, that means Iluvatar, these creatures of thine have only thy will and thy movement. Though you have devised a language for them, they can only report to thee thine own thought. This is a mockery of me. Then Aule, in grief and repentance, humbled himself and asked for pardon. And he said, I will destroy these images of my presumption and wait upon thy will. And he took a great hammer, raising it to smite the eldest of his images. But it flinched and cowered from him. And as he withheld his stroke, astonished, he heard the laughter of Iluvatar. Ha 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 ha! Do you wonder at this? He said. Behold, thy creatures now live, free from thy will. For I have seen thy humility and taken pity on your impatience. Thy making I have taken up into my design. This is the elvish legend of the making of the dwarves. But the elves report that Iluvatar said thus also, Nonetheless, I will not suffer my design to be forestalled. Thy children shall not awake before mine own. And he commanded Aule to lay the fathers of the dwarves severally in deep places, each with his mate, save Durin the eldest, who had none. There they should sleep long, until Iluvatar bade them awake. Nonetheless, there has been, for the most part, little love between the dwarves and the children of Iluvatar. And of the fate that Iluvatar has set upon the children of Aule beyond the circles of the world, elves and men know nothing, and if the dwarves know, they do not speak of it.
Ooh, that was a long one.
That was a good one, yeah, it was long. Well, any last comments before we finish? Anything else related to the letter 212?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. I think.
There is. We might need to carry
Yeah.
on with it next time.
Yeah. for
Any
sure.
brief comments? Well, maybe we can share some next time. We do need to talk briefly before we end here about our meeting. We want to propose that we change it to the second Saturday of every month. It used to be that way many years ago, but about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, we changed it to the third Saturday of the month because of where we were meeting.
Yeah.
But honestly, right now, because of Hawk's project here at the RPG Research Center, training is on first and third Saturdays, and he's not able to be here because of that. He has to run he's been running a role-playing session. So it would really be easier if we moved it to the second one so that he could be involved as usual, and then that would not interfere as much. How would that be with you, Gary and Chris?
Makes no difference to me. I'm free both days.
Without objection, I'll have to swap a couple things around, but they're swappable.
They're swappable. Thanks for being flexible, Chris.
And I have no objection as well.
And I'm fine with that as well. So I will, again, like Chris, I'll change kind of what I do a little bit around to make it work that way. So we'll go ahead and go with that. Otherwise, please, in email, if you could just share your thoughts of who wants to take what. Just be thinking about if you want to take Beowulf, the Poetic and Prose Edda, the Volsunga Saga, or the Mabinogion, or the Kalevala. Those would be all pre 1000. I don't know if the Nibelungenlied should be also in there.
I think it's a little bit later.
It's a little bit later.
Can I take dibs on Beowulf?
Yes, you may. Anyway, so Anthony's got dibs on Beowulf. The rest of us will have to pick up the scraps.
Thank you. Yes. But don't worry, I'll let you guys.
There's lots of other influences on him. So just
That's the only one I ever read.
well, we have a whole month now. So, well, less than a month, I guess, 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks. So there are a number of other things to consider here. Maybe Gary, you can sweet talk. Maybe doing Beowulf together with Anthony.
Yes, let's do it together.
You guys can work on it together. And anyway, but Chris, you and I can kind of think on our own. Maybe Sarah will be able to join us as well. But anyway, we conclude our meeting.
And Ryan, what would have been great is if you listed all the names of those things, so at least we would look up.
Yes, it is in a Google Doc that was shared, but we'll reshare that Google Doc.
Yeah.
And I'll just put it into the message, the body of the message, so you can see that.
Okay.
Okay? Thank you, Gary. Good idea. Okay, well, that's all we have to say for today. Thank you for being part of our meeting, and wherever you are, may you be well. Namarie.
And Namarie.
Yeah.
Stop the live recording.
Yeah, sure. Would you mind turning on the alarm again?
I'll try. I think I'm just going to make a big noise.
Okay, so I think it's ended.
That's the end of the Jitsi meeting, but is it the end of the recording?
Recording.